Hi everyone. I wasn't sure if you wanted to see my face, so here I am. I just want to say that I miss you all before I jump into this. I miss seeing you every day, and I hope that you're doing well as can be expected at home. I know this is totally unprecedented, and even in our discussions in class, I don't think any of us really, well, at least I didn't really consider how extreme the circumstances could become. So just know that I'm here for you if you need anything, and this may be one of the last weeks that I'm with you for the year, but I'm still around, obviously. And you'll be meeting my replacement pretty shortly, but I'll keep in communication about that. So we are going to start today with notes on section 8.1 through 8.4 of your textbook. So we're going to talk about cell division. So this whole chapter is on how cells divide and why they divide, which we've already had some exposure to why they divide. Um, so, okay. So how do little elephants grow up to be big elephants? This is tied to the little brainstorming activity that I had you guys think about today, as well as why do we exist as an accumulation of microscopic cells? And hopefully you started thinking about the whole surface area to volume ratio concept that we have discussed in the past, right? Cells need to stay small because we need a high surface area to volume ratio in order to maximize the ability for materials to move in and out of cells quickly. If a cell becomes too big, the volume is too large, then materials can't diffuse in or out, right? In a time frame that would maintain the health of the cell. You also have the concept of DNA overload. So if cells get too big, then basically the DNA isn't able to control all the workings of the cell, right? So that would be the idea of, if I have a classroom of 25 kids, I'm going to manage that classroom a lot better than I would manage a classroom of 1,000 students, right? So similar idea. So why do they shed their skin? So again, this is just another brainstorm idea for you of why they're actually shedding their skin. Again, anytime that you grow or develop, it's because your cells are actually dividing or reproducing, technically, right? And so when animals shed their skin, they're shedding dead skin cells, and then they have new cells underneath. So let's review the cell theory. So we know that the cell theory states that cells come from pre-existing cells. That was Virchow, which we've discussed before, right? You have some organisms that create identical offspring through asexual reproduction. That's basically an organism that makes an identical copy of itself and thus produces a clone, right? So that's one parent and then a clone offspring. Sexual reproduction is when organisms create similar but not identical offspring. So that would involve two parents. So two parents would be involved in sexual reproduction, typically, unless you have the case of some plants actually have female and male sex organs, but that's a whole other thing. So again, two different ways that we can reproduce, right? Humans, which type of reproduction do we undergo? Hopefully you come to the conclusion that it's sexual reproduction, right? So you are not the same or identical as either one of your parents. You're created by two parents, and you're the offspring that is similar but not identical. So again, cells need to divide, right? When you were first incepted, you were a single cell, you were a fertilized egg, or a zygote, right? And then as you actually grew into more or a more developed embryo and then fetus, you actually did that growing by your cells dividing and basically making identical copies of themselves, right? So that's the whole process that we're going to talk about today. So again, before your cells become too large, your growing cells have to divide or they won't function properly. So that's the whole idea of, again, you need to have a manageable amount of materials to manage the size of the cell and the functions of the cell. And your DNA really is one of the controllers of that as well. When we discuss cell division, we use terms such as parent cells, which are the original cell, and then daughter cells, which are going to be the offspring cells, right? Daughter cells is not to signify any sex connotation. It's not female cells or whatever, but it's just the reference term that's been used. I'm not sure why. So keep in mind that when we talk about cell division, Daughter cells are going to be identical copies of original cells. And in order for that to occur, for you to have identical copies of cells, your DNA has to be made into copies as well, right? So basically, every one of your cells, a few things excluded, have the same DNA in them, right? So all your cells have 46 chromosomes, which we're going to talk about more. So here are just some cool pictures of cells dividing. So you can see how you have different cells that are in different stages, and then they eventually separate out and make two new cells. So why do cells reproduce? So this is going back to the whole purpose of cell division. So in order for multicellular organisms to grow, we grow by dividing, right? Our cells are not, we're not just one big lump of a cell. We have grown and developed by our cells dividing and staying small. So that's really important. You also have cellular reproduction or cell division for repair, right? So when you get a cut on your thumb, or this is not my thumb, this is my finger, you get a cut, right? In order for your skin to heal, your skin cells actually make copies of themselves and then grow new skin, right? And the way that you grow new skin is by your other skin cells dividing and thus reproducing. Unicellular, so prokaryotic or eukaryotic, single-celled organisms would reproduce in order to duplicate themselves. So for a single-celled organism, they're going to basically have offspring just by making an identical copy of themselves, right? And we call that type of reproduction binary fission when we're referring to prokaryotic cells, which, as you know, are bacterial cells, right? So prokaryotes reproduce by what we call binary fission. They basically just make a copy of their DNA, as you can see in the step 2 of the right-hand picture. Whoops. Sorry. As you can see in step 2 of the right-hand picture here, right? So the DNA is copied, and then basically the cell basically pinches in half and just separates out, right? Our process for cellular reproduction or division is a little more complex than bacterial cells. So again, with asexual reproduction, that is cells making identical copies or clones of themselves. So in this example, you have an amoeba cell here, which is going to reproduce by just making a copy of itself, versus bacteria, which again, binary fission is a little different than mitosis, which is what we're talking about with the amoeba, right? A little bit of a different process, but very similar. Okay, so prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells. This is review. Hopefully this is all familiar to you. So you just want to remember that prokaryotic cells are, of course, bacterial cells. So anytime we refer to prokaryotes, we're talking about bacteria only, right? That's really the only category. We have bacteria and archaebacteria that fall under prokaryotic cells. So you want to remember that they're smaller and simpler. And again, they reproduce by binary fission, which is a form of asexual reproduction. So when we actually evaluate the DNA of prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, so the DNA of prokaryotes is going to be shorter, right? They're smaller, they're less complex, so that makes sense. And it's actually organized into only one strand. And we often refer to prokaryotic DNA as circular, which you can actually see in this picture up here, right? Versus eukaryotic DNA is linear and is organized into more segmented chromosomes, which do differ by the type of organism. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so now we're going to get more in depth into chromatin versus condensed chromosomes. So we've talked about chromatin and chromosomes before. Hopefully you remember that both of those terms just refer to your DNA, but it's your DNA when it's existing at different time frames in the cell cycle. So chromatin is DNA, basically it's a combination of your DNA and proteins that the DNA winds around. And chromatin is the relaxed version of your DNA, right? So it looks kind of like spaghetti, we often refer to it as. It's jumbled, it's loose. And chromatin is the form that your DNA has when your cell is conducting its daily activities, right? When it's giving instructions for how to make for the proteins that need to be made, and that type of stuff. Now, when cells get ready to divide, it's going to be super important, of course, that we copy our DNA first before cells divide in half, because your cells, again, need to maintain that genetic information if you're going to make an identical copy. So if you tried to cut the spaghetti in half, would you get identical DNA or even organized DNA in subsequent daughter cells? No, right? That would be a mess. So your DNA actually condenses from chromatin into these super tightly coiled chromosomes in order to ensure that you get identical genetic information in each of your daughter cells, right? So this organized form of DNA is for when cells divide. And we're most familiar with chromosomes in this format because when scientists take pictures of your chromosomes, they're often looking at this version of the chromosomes uh, because they're easier to see. But again, this is when your cells are getting ready to divide. Your DNA will coil up in order to maintain an organized format. This is when your DNA is conducting its daily activities. Okay, so again, before your cell goes through mitosis or cytokinesis, which we have not gotten into yet, but we will, it has to first copy its DNA. So when we're referring to mitosis and cytokinesis, what we're referring to is actual nuclear division is mitosis or division of the nucleus. And cytokinesis is actually division of the cytoplasm or the cell splitting in half. So again, we'll get into those in greater detail later, but this is basically just talking about before your cell divides, right? Before your DNA, your nucleus is copied, and then thus your cell is copied and separated into two, right? You first have to have your DNA copied. Because again, each of your cells, and this is even referring to our own cells, each of your cells have identical DNA in them. And so we need to make sure we copy that DNA to ensure that that genetic information transfers. So again, condensed DNA or condensed chromatin is what chromosomes are. Humans, we have 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs because you get one set of chromosomes from each of your parents. So basically you have half of your genetic information from mom and half from dad. So fruit flies have 8 chromosomes, carrots have 18. We are not organisms that have the most chromosomes. I think dogs have more than us, maybe 78. Don't hold me to that number, but again, the number of chromosomes doesn't necessarily determine the complexity of the organism. But yeah, we have 46 or 23 pairs. So here is a lovely picture of human chromosomes. So you can see if you counted these, you would count 46 total or 23 pairs, right? So here you have basically you get how we organize chromosomes is we'll number them, right? So you have 22 what we call autosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes, right? And you're going to get a lot more into this in chapters 8 and, or I'm sorry, in chapter 9 and 10. That's more focused on even genetic disorders and such, but we'll touch on it here as well. So you can see that these chromosomes we call homologous pairs. So chromosome number 1, for example, you can see you have a certain length, a certain area where you have particular colors or zones, which really are genes that are located, right? So you inherit one of these chromosome number 1s from mom and one of these chromosome number 1s from dad. And we call them a homologous pair because they're not identical, but they hold the same genes on each of those chromosomes, right? So your chromosome number 1, let's say, you know, we're talking about, I'm just making this up, but let's say we're talking about this is the gene for hair color, right? And it's found on chromosome 1. Then you would also find another gene for hair color on the chromosome number 1 you get from dad and the one you get from mom, right? The actual genetic information held in that gene might differ because maybe you inherit something for brown hair from mom and for blonde hair from dad, right? But the location or loci is going to be the same, okay? So again, homologous pairs of chromosomes, you have pairs because you got one of each of these. So you got one chromosome number 1, one number 2, one number 3, one number 4, one number 5 from mom, and you got the other one from dad, right? So the genes that they hold on each of these chromosomes are the same, but the information within those genes might differ, which is where we get variation in traits. One other thing, so the way that you tell the sex of an organism is by the sex chromosomes held. So could you take a guess? Do you think this is a male or a female human that we're looking at here? If you guess male, you are correct. So males have 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. Females would be 2 X chromosomes. So for example, when they did the genetic testing on my baby, right, they put one of these karyotypes, which is what this is called, together to evaluate are there any genetic disorders, which we'll get into later. And then they also could determine